Good morning, everybody. It is March 10th, 2022, and it's great to see you today. Hope you're off to a great day wherever you are. It is Thursday, and this is our normal hour where we take a little extra time to take a deeper dive with the news. We call it our debrief, and today we actually have something special. Last night, I kind of mapped out what we were going to talk about today, but this morning I woke up to a message from Holly McKay, who's on the ground in Ukraine, and she said that she had some bandwidth today, literally and figuratively, to actually jump on live with us on an Instagram live. And I want to take advantage of that because it's very rare that we're able to actually have a conversation with someone like Holly overseas on the ground in Ukraine. And it's a great opportunity. So we're going to get her in just a moment. I'm going to let a couple of our audience members that are watching live jump on. If you're watching this later, it's great to see you as well. And one of the reasons why I think it's really important to talk to someone on the ground in Ukraine is because we are seeing a lot of mixed reports. It's something that we can talk about with Holly. And I noticed something even in the Pentagon briefing yesterday that I want to talk to you about that I thought was interesting and perhaps a sign of, I don't want to say discord, but maybe a lack of coordination. I'm going to ask Holly about it. Let's just set the stage, though. We're about 2 weeks into this war, the Russian war on Ukraine. And let me just show you very quickly so we get oriented for a map about where we are. You can see the capital city of Kyiv, and you can see the areas in red are the areas where we are seeing Russian forces, the invasion of Russian forces. You see that city that we talked about last week at this time, Kherson, that was overtaken by Russian forces, believed to be the first city to fall to Russian forces in Ukraine. And of course, we're watching to see if others fall as well. Real quick, let me show you what the Pentagon talked about yesterday, just as far as where are Russian forces attacking? Are they getting closer to the border with Poland? What about NATO countries being threatened? We know that there's a threat in general when there's war, in the chaos of war, but have any bombs landed close to NATO countries? And this is what the press secretary said, John Kirby. He said if you draw a line straight from Kyiv, the capital city of Kyiv, down to Odessa, and just look to the right of that line, that's where all of the Russian attacks have taken place. So you're still seeing a big portion of the country, Western Ukraine, that hasn't experienced what the eastern part of the country has. And so that's just sort of interesting to take a look at the map as it stands now. Let me go ahead and take that down and see if we can pull Holly in now. It's one of those things with social media. We can all sort of complain about social media. I know I have. And you wonder, man, is this good for me? Is this really what we should be doing? But then social media allows something like this, where we're able to see each other. Hi, Holly. How are you?
Hi. Good. How are you? Sorry. Bad lighting here.
Oh, well, where are you, Holly? Where actually are you at this moment?
I'm in Kyiv in my hotel room. So
And is there hotels functioning just sort of
there
like
are
normal?
there are a few, not that many, but there are a few that journalists and sort of aid workers and locals are staying in. So thankfully, there's a couple of places for us to stay.
Well, it's very difficult to understand what life is even like in Ukraine at this moment, which is part of the great reason we're able to speak with you today and get a little more insight onto that. Let me just give you a full introduction for those that may be new, because we do have new audience members. You are a writer, journalist, war correspondent. You have been to so many of the hotspots around the world, from Syria to Iraq. You've reported from Iran, you've reported from Afghanistan, and now you're in Ukraine. And you were there earlier before the war kicked off. You left, and then you made your way back in via Hungary. So let's just start there. Why did you decide to go back? And how did you get back into the country, Holly? Because at that point, the war had started.
Yeah, it was a little challenging. Yes, I was here. I kind of went back, and then the invasion happened, and it was just something I felt was extremely important to document, especially because, I knew that a lot of people that had been here, journalists, would be leaving because of the threat. And I just feel that it's very strongly about, continuing to tell these stories, and that was something I'd already invested a lot of myself into. So I basically didn't really have a plan. I flew back to Budapest, and had someone I didn't even know who basically said, you can sleep on my apartment floor if you need a place. I didn't know this person from a bar of soap. I was like, okay, they sound normal, not a serial killer, let's do it. So I did. I stayed there, and then the next day they drove me about 4 hours down to the border where we were sort of helping refugees and gave out supplies there. Again, I slept in a schoolroom floor. And then the person that sort of took me left to go back to Budapest, and I went to a church and said, can I just stay here while I try to figure out how to get back to Kyiv, which at that point, it's very far from the Hungarian border. So I slept in a church and then made a few calls, and thankfully, somebody said, look, I can send someone to pick you up from the Ukrainian border and take you to Kyiv tomorrow. And this was, again, someone I didn't know. So I crossed the border the next morning. I just walked over the border, and somebody was there to get me, and we made sort of a 25-hour non-stop through the night, going through back roads because a lot of the bridges were bombed and things, to get back into Kyiv. And yeah, I think everyone was a little bit surprised I actually made it, because at that point everybody had sort of said that was impossible. It was surrounded, which I knew it wasn't surrounded. Again, that was another thing that was sort of being pushed by the White House and by other people, and that this idea that Kyiv was surrounded. But when I sort of talked to people on the ground, it was clear to me that certainly parts of it was surrounded, but not the entire city. So I knew that I could get back in, much to everybody trying to argue with me that I couldn't. So that's the short version.
We've worked together a short period of time, and during that time, it's been really wonderful. Our friendship has also bloomed, and I'll just add to this that Holly was sort of checking in and telling me what was going on. And I know better at this point to tell Holly what to do. I just here to be supportive and to keep tabs on her best I can, and to highlight your reporting as best I can as well. Because if any, as we talked about even last time, every single news organization should be highlighting your work, because you're actually on the ground. And a lot of journalists that are there if they're doing any broadcasting, Holly, as you know, are kind of stuck in front of the camera, waiting to talk to an anchor somewhere around the world and not out and about. So I really want to talk to you about what it's like. What is it like in Ukraine right now? What is it like in Kyiv today?
Right.
Let's just start there.
Right. So, I mean, it's a city that's entirely shut down in terms of nothing is open. Like I had a bit of a burn accident, and I cannot get antibiotics, and I cannot even buy loose fitting thermal clothes. So I'm struggling with the cold a little bit, because all the thermals I bought, I can no longer wear because of my burn. So that's been a bit of a challenge, and there's literally nothing open. Each day you get sort of a notification that will tell you what markets will be open that day, between what time. And so people can go there to sort of get supplies, although really so much is just empty. Like the shelves are just empty, and they're not really getting restocked. So I mean, to find hair shampoo, I had to go on a wild goose chase. So things are just very difficult for people. And again, there aren't many cars in the street, but it does take you a while to get somewhere, because there are checkpoints set up every couple of blocks. You sort of have to wind through these big concrete blocks that they put up so that cars can't sort of stream through. So there's a lot of logistical challenges with that. You can't get a cab, you can't sort of do a lot of the basic things to get around, which is certainly challenging when you are an independent journalist on your own and you don't have the backing of big news crews and big teams. I am sort of functioning by myself. So it is certainly logistically challenging, but you just kind of work through it each day. And then, it's persistent shelling. So you have to grow very used to the idea of artillery going off constantly. And that is, during the day, during night, it can be quiet for a few hours, and then you just suddenly hear a bunch of really loud explosions. And I think everyone just gets used to that somewhere. You get used to the air raid sirens going off. Curfew is between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m., I believe, or 7 a.m. So during that time, you have to stay indoors. You can't go out, otherwise you will risk getting shot. So it's it's an entirely military, basically just a military fortress right now. And when you go to the towns outside of Kyiv, just 10 miles away, really, they've absolutely been battered. So I've been going to several of those towns and evacuation points, and they're absolutely, bombed to smithereens, and people are just sort of emerging, trying to be evacuated, and just the level of trauma that people are experiencing, and just their faces. And a lot of these people are elderly and they're disabled, and they've been living in a bunker for 7 or 8 days without medicine, without food, without running water. And now they're sort of finally coming out and seeing a completely destroyed city, and trying to go to safety, even though there really isn't anywhere safe to go. And it's really a harrowing thing, because I can't imagine just what is that like, to in less than 2 weeks for your life to be upended like that. And to know there really isn't a safe place you can get to, and to not know, yesterday I went to an evacuation point where they were bringing people that were just freshly evacuated during this sort of ceasefire window. And even as we're at this evacuation point outside the city, the level of shelling was huge. And I just, I looked at a friend of mine is with me, and I said, we need to go, because they're going to hit this place soon. And just the people that had already been through all this trauma. I met one man, and the story will be out later today, but I met one man. He was shot in the hand, and he's also had wounds to his head, and was sort of in these bloody bandages, kind of sitting, in the mud, basically. And when I went to talk to him, his name was Igor, and he's showing me these pictures on his phone of his dogs, and the Russians had shot his dog. So he tried to escape in his car, and the Russians had shot at his car and shot him, and killed his dog. And he's all by himself, just sort of sitting there. And then I met this other woman, and she had a newborn baby, and the baby was 5 days old. And I went to talk to her, and she's, this poor little baby sleeping, and she's trying to figure out where she's going to go, because she's at an evacuation point with nowhere to go. And then when I asked her, is this your first baby? She said, no, I've got 2 other children. And then she just broke down crying, because the 2 other children, because when she went to give birth, the 2 other children went with neighbors, I believe, and because the dad is off fighting. And then now she can't reach those children, and they're in a place called Bucha, which is under very, very heavy bombardment. There is no telephone, there is no internet, there's no electricity, there's no water. So this is just an example of what is sort of happening around Kyiv right now. And it's happening in a lot of parts of the country. And it's so hard to wrap your head around it, because it's just so nonsensical. And every person is just going through so much pain. And it's just really hard for them to imagine why this is even happening.
We have a lot of questions on all of that, Holly. So let me just take a few of them bit by bit. Instantly, when you mentioned your burn, we have a few questions, including from Shelley. They just wanted to get some clarity on whether or not you were injured while out and reporting, if something happened from the shelling. Can you just provide a little clarity as to what took place?
In a bombing. It was just an accident that happened in the hotel. Just an unfortunate boiling water accident that happened with something that went wrong at the hotel. So it's just, I'm fine. I don't even like to bring it up, because the people going through worse things, but it certainly made life a little bit more challenging for me. And I certainly appreciate small things like aspirin, which I very limited amount of when I came, because I was coming by myself with a backpack. So, but luckily, I do have good friends here, friends of mine who run a mobile hospital. Also, I saw a UN doctor today. So really for me, it's just trying to keep it clean so that it doesn't get infected, which is always a challenge with very, very big burns and very deep burns. But it's certainly not what I had anticipated coming to deal with on top of everything else. But that's life, and you deal with it and you get along with it. And that's just the way it is.
When people are evacuating, where are they going? How are they are they able to get out?
So they basically put them on big school buses and things, or a lot of the injured ones, we were, when I went with the medics, we were taking them in the ambulance, and there's sort of they call it a transition point. So there's a transition point just outside the city. And so basically they go there, which is supposed to be, a green corridor that's safe. And really from there, they have to figure out where they're going. And, again, if they're lucky, they have a small suitcase of stuff. And then they get to a point and, maybe hopefully see a relative, or figure out if they can get on another convoy that goes west, or something. It's really, it's hard to wrap my head around. I mean, yesterday I saw this teenage boy at the evacuation point, and he was like holding up a sign with, I think it was his mother or his sister's name on it. And he was probably about 15, this kid, and he just stood there in the snow for about 4 or 5 hours, just looking at every bus that came in, just waiting to see. And it was clear he was alone, and it broke my heart, because I thought, this poor kid, he's all alone with like a sign that you would see at the airport when you got off a plane, waiting for somebody to come to take care of him. And it's stories like that. It's just hard to believe why any of it's sort of happening. And again, yeah, these people don't know where they're going to go. Maybe they'll go to a shelter. Maybe they'll go to a bunker. Maybe, they'll go to there's different places that have been set up. And mind you, nowhere is safe, because even when you go somewhere, it's not necessarily safe. Like yesterday as well, I was in a medical tent, and I saw her. There was a girl. She was on her own, probably in her early 20s, and I could hear her on the phone to somebody, and then you would hear the shelling, and she just went into an absolute panic attack and just started screaming and running like up and down, this tent, because she couldn't sort of fathom the idea of this continuing. So it just sort of shows you just how people are trying to cope with this sort of reality. It's yeah, it's something it's extremely hard. I think especially in the US, it's hard to sort of wrap our heads around how or why this is happening, and how many people it's really affecting.
How are you coping, Holly?
I mean, I I think you have to be pragmatic when you're doing this work. You have to know. I think for me, my job is to tell the stories, and I think that's important to sort of keep that in mind. I think that the way that I can be of service to people, certainly is to continue to tell their stories. And you have to have compassion. That's really, really important. You can't be the person that completely compartmentalizes, but to a degree you have to be able to sort of separate yourself as well, so that you can do the work. And you also have to be aware of what you can take on and what you can't. I mean, this, also happened in Afghanistan, but you'd be constantly, I'd just get constant messages from people wanting, help with someone being evacuated, or wanting certain things. And I think can become very overwhelming. So I sort of have to be very clear with my own boundaries, in terms of, here's a number, here's a place to call. I cannot handle the evacuation for you. I'm so sorry. As much as I'd love to, that is not my wheelhouse. And if I try to take on too many things that are outside my realm, I'm not going to do what I came here to do. So I just think sometimes it's really difficult and sad and heartbreaking, but you have to put boundaries up for yourself. Otherwise, I wouldn't get my work done.
Are you scared?
I'm not scared. I mean, it's a unique feeling. Certainly, it's not, the idea of a whole bunch of Russian tanks outside the city, and, I guess the constant bombing that can hit anywhere. I wouldn't say I'm scared. I'd say that I am cautious, but that I believe strongly in telling the story. So therefore, I think that overrides, any grave fear right now. But again, it's all day to day.
Yeah.
Take it day to day. Yeah. If you start to sort of dwell too much in what could happen, what might happen, what will happen, that's when you start to lose yourself. So you just got to stay clear and focused.
I think it's a good time to remind everybody that when Holly goes into war zones like this, and you can see how independent she is. She's also an independent journalist. So she is constantly meeting deadlines for different media organizations. We're obviously working together. We're able to highlight some of her work by editing together these little video snippets and reports that are so valuable to us, Holly. Thank you. But she's really doing this all by herself. And I want to underscore that. She's really doing it all by herself. So if you want to support Hollie's work, there are a couple ways you can do it. You can go to her website. You can sign up for her Substack, which is her newsletter, where she gives a lot of background insight into her reporting, shares unique photos. You can sign up for that right through her Instagram account as well. You also see her latest articles there. And she also has a book that she wrote on her past experience in Syria and Iraq. So you could also buy that. There's a couple different ways. But if we are really about supporting journalists, which we are, I just want to, I know you're not going to say it, Hollie, because we're going to focus on the tie. I just want everybody to really know that this is her business, it's her passion, but we have to support her as well. And so that's what I'm trying to do through Smarter News in a couple different ways, but you can do it by yourself and you can actually support and fund good journalism that's happening all over the world. So I just want to underscore that. Hollie, how does what you're going through now, and I'm going to move to some of the more logistic questions about the Russians and Ukrainians and some of these dynamics at play, but I am curious for one more personal perspective. You know, you've interviewed ISIS. You were in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over. You've been in very serious situations where there was a great deal of unknown and danger. How does what you're going through now compare to those experiences?
I mean, each threat's different. Well, I mean, groups like ISIS and the Taliban, they obviously are suicide bombings, but they don't have air power, and that makes certainly a big difference. When you're looking at the second most powerful military in the world, it's certainly a different threat factor. And I also think Russians they're not in it for PR. As we've seen a lot of videos, a lot of journalists have been shot at and sort of specifically targeted. So they really don't care about sort of PR. I think, maybe to a degree, especially in the beginning, the Taliban was concerned with trying to put out a relatively, quote unquote good face, but certainly I don't think that the Russians have any care or interest in that. So, being a journalist or a foreigner is not going to get you any special treatment, may even get you worse treatment. So there are definitely, it's certainly a different threat. And I think that it's hard to always compare, but it's certainly, yeah, I would probably say it's a little bit more daunting than even interviewing ISIS, I guess, at this point, just because the indiscriminate bombing, nobody really sort of knows when they're going to enter the city or how they're going to enter the city or how, really each day will unfold. So it's definitely a different level of anxiety for sure.
If you wanted to leave now, let's say you just decided tonight, I'm going to leave. I'm going to get out of Kyiv. Could you do it? Could you do it safely?
I mean, it's difficult logistically, but yes, I could probably, use my contacts to find someone that would be able to drive me out of the city, if I wanted to do that. Right now, it's, I think there's still a window to do that. I don't know how long that window is open for. I don't have any plans to leave at the moment. As I said, day by day, I think that yeah, day by day, really. I think, there's it's a very individual thing for people to decide at what point they want to leave or they don't, or they want to stay. And I think, to me, I am a war reporter. It doesn't make sense for me to leave when the war starts. And for some journalists, they may not feel comfortable and immediately, want to go, and that is totally respectable. But for me, yeah, it's certainly a struggle to abandon a story once you are invested in it, once you are invested with the people that are here, that choose to be here. And I think that, that's something Ukraine really appreciates. The Ukrainian people, is that journalists are here to tell their stories, and that is something that is incredibly important to them, especially when you see how, what a stronghold the Russians have on propaganda, and that they're able to just absolutely twist this with such nonsense, and really get away with it. And even, Ukrainians say to me, I've got friends, family in Russia, and they don't believe me. Even Igor, who was shot and had his dog killed, was showing me photos that he'd sent to family in Russia and of his injuries, and they just said, "We don't believe you. This isn't true." So I do think it's really important to do whatever we can to continue to fight back against the narrative and hope that it gets through to somehow to the Russian people, because at the end of the day, you know, the onus is on them to change their leadership or do something that's going to fix this. I mean, nobody else can, you know, bring about regime change except for Russian people. And, you know, without that, I don't kind of know what future Europe or the West is really looking at with this persistent threat.
What can you tell about Russian forces around Kyiv or around the areas? What are you hearing from your sources? What are you also seeing as far as what sort of activity is taking place? Just for a little background, the perspective that we're getting here back at home is there's all this talk still about a convoy that's been not really very efficient moving towards the city. But tell us about, like, when you're looking outside your hotel window, I mean, can you see Russian forces? Do you see Russian jets overhead? What is it like?
You don't really see the jets. You can only really hear them is the thing. You hear them, but you don't see them. There aren't any Russian tanks inside the city, but certainly in areas around the city where they have sort of a foothold or there's a lot of fighting, or certain areas that are occupied, there are Russian tanks. But where I am, you don't see them. Yeah, so my sort of understanding of it is that they're moved into different areas that are around Kyiv. They're the ones that are being really hit right now. So Kyiv is kind of like sort of like, if you look at it like a state. So you've got a state, and then you've got your capital administration, and then you've got the state administration, and they run a little bit separately. But the towns around Kyiv are the ones that are being absolutely battered right now. The Russians, obviously, the big prize is to get into the city, but they haven't gotten there yet. So the strategy is to sort of batter the surrounding towns. You know, try to move forth and occupy them, which they have done, certain places that are occupied. And then I guess then to sort of be able to move forth into the city. The Ukrainians are really holding them out in terms of the sort of the foot soldiers and things. So they're really able to stop the tanks from moving too much further in. But at what point, I think, do the Russians end up kind of just going crazy with the air bombardment and sort of obliterating it that way? And Ukrainians know that whilst they might be able to fight them on the ground, they're not a match for air power in that way. So it's certainly a worry, which is why you're seeing a sort of constant push for the no-fly zone, which NATO has already refused, out of concerns that will make the war, you know, it'll spread the war, and you're dealing with the nuclear power, obviously, which nobody wants to deal with. But it's very hard to explain that to a Ukrainian person who's watching children die, who's seeing hospitals be bombed and schools bombed, and it's so hard to sort of look at a Ukrainian person when they ask you why will the West not put up a no-fly zone? And it's so hard to sort of say, well, you know, the West doesn't want the war to come to them. So, and Ukrainians will just look at you and say, but it already is. The war is already here. So it's certainly difficult for them to sort of accept that line, I guess, that their lives are somehow not worth trying to implement a no-fly zone. Having said that, I don't know that a no-fly zone would really be able to do that much now. I certainly wouldn't expect that Russians would care to not violate that. I think perhaps if that had been set up before the full-on invasion, it might have made a difference, but I don't know right now. Again, it's hard to know, but Ukrainians sort of see that as a bit of a lifeline, that everyone you meet, there's even billboards. So when you're driving around the city, you see billboards. There's sort of those flashing, changing billboards that are basically like, NATO closed the skies, is what they say. And I just don't see that realistically happening anytime soon.
How organized are the Ukrainian forces?
I mean, I think, well, I mean, I think you're seeing a big change in them. I don't know. There's a lot of moving parts to it, but I think, you know, they've really come together in an incredible way over the last couple of weeks. And I think there are different people handling different areas, and they're slowly trying to coordinate things a little bit better. But yeah, it's definitely, you know, it's not, you know, it doesn't have the sort of the ranking and the systems of the United States military, but you know, they're doing an incredible job as it stands right now. So they are trying to kind of pull. They've got the territorial defenses, which is the civilian side. You've got the military, and then you've also got just volunteers, which is usually the retired military or other people that do have a fighting background, but they're no longer active. So there are a lot of moving parts, and I think people are just sort of finding their place with that.
Based on what you've seen and knowing that Russia has one of the most powerful militaries in the entire world, does it surprise you that the movement hasn't been faster towards Kyiv? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think everybody's been a little bit surprised by how inept the Russian forces really are. I mean, I think my understanding from people that have interrogated, captured Russian soldiers was that they were basically told that they would have the capital within two days and that the war would be over within 15 days. So that was the analogy that was given, and that certainly is not true because we're now on day 13. So I think that that Russia very much underestimated overestimated their abilities. I think that a lot of the soldiers were not really aware that they were even going to war, and B, just have no concept of Ukraine from a map point of view, of understanding the terrain and the geography. And then on top of that, I think also was surprised by Ukraine's ability to fight. I think that Putin never expected the Ukrainian forces to be really as well equipped or as capable as they've proven to be. So I think there are many different factors in that, but I think that it's certainly a humiliation, I think, for Putin, and certainly the international community, I'm sure, is looking at the Russian forces, and despite having a lot of weaponry, they really are surprisingly, terrible kind of on the battlefield. And they've pretty much deployed almost 100% of the fighters that they had lined up around Ukraine. But also it's important to remember that the Ukrainians are not necessarily outnumbered. So I think Ukrainian forces, really, with all the volunteers and the territorial defense, you're looking probably at about 300,000 troops, whereas Russia, had probably 150, 160,000 that they had stationed around the border, and are probably now having to call in more conscripts. I've heard reports that they are trying to recruit fighters from Syria as well. Obviously, Putin is a big ally of Bashar al-Assad, and Russia has done an awful lot of damage in Syria in terms of bombing. So that's sort of what we're hearing right now. So Ukraine is strong on the numbers. It just isn't a match for the air power, and that is the kryptonite.
What's happening in the last 24 hours, just to add to this, is the first of its kind meeting between the Russian foreign minister, and I believe it's the foreign minister of Ukraine, not the prime minister. That was happening in Turkey, which is really interesting because the previous meetings have happened on the border of Belarus. And so Turkey's a NATO member. Turkey has good relationship with Russia, which has always been a bit of a quandary for other NATO members and has put Turkey in somewhat of a fraught position at times, but a question about Turkey's continued NATO membership for a few different reasons. But Turkey has also supplied the Ukrainians with drones. So it's kind of an interesting role. From what we heard of what happened at this meeting, Holly, and I'm sure you saw these headlines too, was that there really wasn't a lot of movement. One of the things that Russia really wants is for Ukraine to say once and for all, no, we're not going to join NATO, which is not really the issue. The larger issue is that Russia wants Ukraine to say those areas like Crimea, those are actually Russian. And Ukraine is not willing to do that at this time, is not ready to say any of that territory that's been contested for the last 8 years is Russian. What are you hearing from your Ukrainian sources about that? Is that something that the Ukrainian public would be willing to concede to Russia? Or is there something else going on that we should know about?
Ukrainians are so angry about what's happening and what Russia is doing that they're not willing to make a concession. They are very much of the nature of we don't want to give them anything. Why should we give them anything? Look what they're doing to us. And Ukrainians have really come together and pretty much have said, we'll fight them to the death. We're not willing to concede anything to them right now. Not when they're killing our children, and why should we do them any favors? And Ukrainians are really united in an incredible way and have an incredible something I've never really seen to this extent, just willingness to sort of fight and to stay in the fight and to, fight to the death, which isn't something that you sort of see a lot anymore, especially, when things become the pressure point that they are. I think that it's a very, very remarkable time, and the strength that Ukrainians have shown is absolutely remarkable on every level.
Well, that's really powerful insight, because sometimes you wonder whether or not the people in power are actually reflecting the will of the people. And it sounds like they are, that the will of the people is, no, we're not giving up any territory, actually. So that's interesting to note. It's consistent.
I mean, a couple of days ago, I went to an apartment building where there are these, they call them the grannies who make Molotov cocktails. So these women who were all sort of over 60, widows or grandmas and things, they live in this apartment building and they make Molotov cocktails all day. And even when you talk to them, they're just like, why would we give them anything? If I see a Russian, I'm going to throw a Molotov cocktail at him, or, I'll hit him with my hand. So even, on every sort of level, there isn't a willingness to sort of bow down or give them anything. And I think, again, when a country acts like a bully and comes in and starts killing Ukrainian people and children, and why should they feel that they owe them any sort of favors? And Ukraine feels very strongly that those areas are belong to Ukraine. They do not belong to Russia. So why should Russia just get them because Russia has big bombs and says we want it? I mean, you can hold a gun to somebody's head, but Ukraine is not sort of willing to take the bait. That's not to say that I'm sure that they wouldn't sit down and have certain diplomatic negotiations, but I don't think right now they're in any position to want to hand over parts of their territory.
When you were in the area right outside of Kyiv, the suburb that was getting bombed, I'm sorry, there's a little bit of feedback. I think it's when I'm talking, so I'll try to just keep the question short. Was that a period of time where there was a ceasefire agreement or a thought of a ceasefire agreement when these innocent people were being targeted by shelling?
I mean, the ceasefire thing is very murky to me. I don't know. I mean, there are certain agreements that come to ceasefires, but it seems to me that almost every time there is a ceasefire, that it is violated in some way, by the Russians. So I'm not sure. I think, there are supposed to be ceasefire agreements in order to enable evacuations to happen, but they're not necessarily followed by any stretch of the imagination. So it is, it's just as kind of risky to make that decision to leave as it is to kind of continue to stay in a bunker. So it's just a very unfathomable situation all around.
I want to share with you a situation that happened at the Pentagon briefing yesterday. I just thought was really interesting. And Holly, are you able to hear me okay?
I am. I mean, I hear a little bit of feedback, but I can hear you fine.
Okay, I'm just going to keep going, and then if it's bad,
it's killing me. Sorry, I'm not very technical equipped with my
well, if you're holding your phone for this time period, it can get
now.
So we'll try to work through it. So hopefully, guys, it's okay for you audio wise. I just thought this was a really interesting exchange yesterday at the Pentagon briefing. I'm not sure what to make of it, but I want to give everybody the situation. It was about a 45-minute briefing. The Pentagon was very straightforward about not supplying planes to Ukraine. They said that the Ukrainians don't even need the fighter jets. It's not even going to be efficient. They go through this whole long thing, but then they're getting peppered with questions about all sorts of topics, including what was the big story of the day, which was a bombing, reported bombing in the city of Mariupol, which is in the south, near or around a maternity hospital and a children's hospital. Now, many of our audience has probably seen images to this effect. The networks all over the news have been reporting it. And yes, at a time of war, you do have to sort of insert that reported, right, Holly? Like, it's difficult to confirm. I can't necessarily confirm anything in Ukraine, but we're seeing the images. The Ukrainian officials are talking about it. It's very clear something happened there. We don't know exactly all the specifics, but here's how the Pentagon answered this question, which was asked, I saw this, the journalist says, I saw that the Ukrainians claim that a maternity and children's hospital in Mariupol was hit directly by a Russian strike. Do you have anything on that? And the Pentagon then says, I'm afraid I don't. I've seen those same reports you have, but we're not in a position to be able to independently verify that. Obviously, that's a horrific outcome, regardless of whether it was intentional or not. If it's true, and we have no reason to doubt that it's true, we just can't independently verify that. And then it goes on to say, you know, well, the Russians, they've done this in the past. I just thought that was sort of a peculiar answer because of, you know, does the United States have satellite imagery? Do we have people on the ground? We do have a clandestine force. You know, there could be allies of ours that are on the ground that are able to see and confirm things. For the Pentagon and the Defense Department not to come out more strongly and say, yes, the Ukrainians are saying this and we have every reason to believe this has actually happened, that was just sort of a lukewarm response. And I wasn't sure, you know, I understand being careful. I'm very careful as a journalist, and I've even talked to our audience about, I'm not sharing a lot of images that I can't verify. Some images that have been shared about Ukraine were actually images from Syria because they're so similar, because there's you know, there's similar destruction and children targeting. But what do you make of that? I mean, first of all, have you run into any other Americans besides journalists, Holly? Anybody that's an NGO or someone that could be working for the government?
There are some people that I know that are here who are sort of doing medical work. I have inquired about terms of fighters, and I am told that there are American fighters here that are sort of looking at drone imagery and other things as well. But I haven't encountered personally any fighters. I've just sort of heard this from you know, mutual friends and things. But there are certainly different medics and people here, and some other people that are facilitating supposed rescues. I don't know exactly what they're doing, but there are people here.
Right. There are people.
Yeah.
There are all sorts of people that, you know, that's what I'm also sort of just gleaning over. There's all sorts of people that the Pentagon can be using as resources. And maybe I'm giving them too much credit. The reason why this also sort of sparked something in me is this reminded me of talking about Afghanistan and the withdrawal of Afghanistan and the lack of precise information. And I don't know what to make of it.
I don't know that the US sort of is as, I mean, sometimes we tend to look at the US and think, oh gosh, you know, it has to be the most powerful place on the planet with, you know, the ability to see a pimple on your nose from this, you know, 20,000 feet in the sky. But I don't know that they actually have that really ability. And I mean, I see this in most countries that I work in, whether it's Syria or Yemen or Afghanistan. The US doesn't necessarily have that many sort of resources on the ground. I don't think it is as, I mean, not to, you know, the intelligence community does an incredible job, but I think that it's not the things that we think what the US has to know. I don't always know that they actually do know. So I think that's sort of, you know, and again, it also comes down to certain, sort of respecting, I guess, the independence of other countries as well at the same time. And I think the US, especially in something like Ukraine, they don't want to be sort of seeing, I guess, confirming certain things when really this is, you know, this is Ukraine's sort of, that's their job. This is their territory. The US is not involved directly in the war. It's sort of you know, very much in the backseat support. So I think the US is probably careful on a sort of a diplomatic level to make sure that they're not over-speaking or speaking for Ukraine or even trying to sort of insert themselves as being somehow more involved in the war than they are, because I think that they are very aware of the implications of that in terms of, you know, how Russia sees the Western involvement. And, you know, again, somebody told me, somebody who escaped the Russian territory yesterday also said, occupied territory yesterday, said that, you know, when he's at the checkpoint, the Russian soldiers basically said to him, look, we're not at war with Ukraine or Ukrainians, we're at war with the US in Ukraine. So that sort of tends to be that the line of Russian thinking is somehow that Ukraine has been corrupted or co-opted by US and by the West, and that's what they're trying to fight against. So that was sort of an interesting little sort of phrasing that a gentleman gave me yesterday.
That's really interesting because that actually provides a little bit more foundation for how the Pentagon was speaking yesterday. Yeah. Because the repeated line for the Pentagon is, we don't want to make this worse. And if we get more involved, this is going to get a lot worse, and also confirm what Russian propaganda is saying about this situation. And so if that's what Russian soldiers are actually saying, then that's interesting.
and provides a little bit more of like, well, we're going to be a little bit distant in how much we get involved in confirming or not confirming. And, obviously this is also where that answer is very important, but it's also important for journalists then to fill in the blanks. Maybe I can't confirm what's going on in Mariupol, but I can tell you that Russia has a history in the recent decades of either bombing themselves areas with women and children and innocent people repeatedly to the point of complete destruction, or aiding other people like President Assad in Syria doing the same thing. So that's where we can fill in and say, we don't really, are we in Mariupol? No. But they've done this, this time. So it's consistent behavior. And I think that way, that's why that context is really important. I mean, those areas that don't have electricity, they don't have cell service. Are you getting any information out of the areas in the South about how
just
bad
from
it
people
is there?
that are leaving, it's very hard to sort of get that kind of information from people that are in the cities. I mean, a lot of it's just it's kind of standing at the evacuation points and getting people as they come out. I do have Mariupol sources. A friend of mine, she was able to speak to her parents in there yesterday. She just left Mariupol herself, so she got out and she wasn't able to contact her parents for several days. She did say she had a phone line with them. I think it was on Wednesday. So she was able to establish a bit of a connection there. So, it's just trying to piece together the information, as best you can. And that's what makes war really such a challenging environment, because, when people are cut off from the world, it's hard to imagine this in the 21st century, how it's sort of even possible, but that's sort of the fundamental go-to, I think, when it comes to the Russian strategy and many strategies in war is to be sort of cut people off from civilization so that they can't report what's happening. And then you sort of, don't be surprised if you see in a lot of these places, people that are starving, they're being bombed, they're living in bunkers, they're really pushed to the brink. And then the Russian playbook is then to suddenly, go in when they're at the very verge of death or whatever it may be, and then suddenly start to provide, aid to them, and then film that, and then that is used as propaganda on Russian TV. Oh, look what our soldiers are doing. They're saving these people's lives and giving them food and medicine, and basically just making people, grateful, whatever, because they're sort of on the brink of death to get any help that they possibly can. So it is also part of that Russian playbook too, is to kind of push people to the brink and then try to sort of come in as some Robin Hood savior, to, I guess, again, co-opt some sort of support.
How long do you think Ukraine has before running completely out of supplies, like in the city of Kyiv, of food and water and the things?
Well, I think right now it's okay. I mean, as I said, there's still that corridor to the west, toward Poland and Lviv and other places where it's relatively safe, and so supplies are sort of able to come in. It's very limited with people's ability. Obviously there's no flights or things like that, so you're looking at really just trucks and things trying to come in, and it's a really arduous journey for any imports right now. So I would hesitate to sort of put a figure on when things will run out. I think there are some replenishments, but it's just if that supply line gets cut off the way that we've seen in Kyiv and other cities, then you're looking at a big problem. Then it's, journalists can't file. I can't speak to you. I don't have electricity. So, it's just kind of crossing fingers to hope that doesn't get to that point. But that seems to be the strategy that Russians have been taking in a lot of other places. So it's certainly a very high possibility of that happening in Kyiv.
I have a couple more questions from some of our audience members. They wrote in before we jumped on, but if anyone that is live has some questions for Holly as well. I know you've been really generous, Holly. I know you have work to do and deadlines to meet. So I'll just take a couple more of the minutes of your time. What are you seeing as far as, there's been a lot of questions about, I'm going to ask you about two different hot topics in the United States. One is about bioweapons. One is about nuclear plants. Have you heard about either, without providing too much of a narrative, because it's all kind of rolled up in I don't want to say very controversial. I can give a little background on each, but before I do, have you heard anything about either inside Ukraine or those big stories?
I know that there are warnings about the chemical weapons, and certainly as someone who's covered Syria, there was a lot of chemical bombing that happened there. It was unclear whether that was coming from the Assad regime or that was coming from Russia. I'm sure if it was coming from Assad, it was certainly coming with the knowledge that, you know, Russia had the knowledge that that was happening or that was going to happen. So things that might seem far-fetched are still very much in the realm of possibility. Russia is not a place that cares about human life. It's not a place that cares about its own soldiers. I mean, there are thousands of soldiers, hundreds of soldiers dying a day. You know, something like a rough estimate of 8,000 somewhere to probably 10,000 soldiers that have already been killed in this a war that's not even 2 weeks old. And Russia doesn't care about that. They don't care about human lives the way that, you know, we are conditioned often to think that you know, when an American dies in the battlefield, 6, 7, 8 more people risk their life to go and find that body. Whereas for Russia, it's that's not their concern at all. So the use of chemical weapons, to me, chemical weapons often become a sideshow because they're not necessarily, you know, if a barrel bomb is being dropped on a residential building, to me, that, you know, that's just as atrocious as the chemical weapons. But chemical weapons sort of have this sort of extra layer of fear and terror, I guess, that they tend to spread, even though they may not necessarily kill more people. They're just sort of, it's obviously banned, you know, it's obviously internationally banned, but so is dropping a bomb on a civilian neighborhood. So I think we can get a little bit too wrapped up in the chemical weapons argument that we lose sight of the big picture, that bombing is bombing, regardless of whether it's a bomb that's full of nails or a bomb that's you know, full of chlorine. So I think it's a possibility, but it's not something I've seen yet. And hope I don't see. The nuclear plants, now that's always been an issue in Ukraine, really going back to 2014 since the war started. Ukraine is a very industrial country. There are many nuclear plants, and they've already been hit in the war. I remember being here, I was actually in Russia in 2017 and covering chemical hits that were in the Donbass region that happened then. So this has happened before. This isn't new. Certainly it's getting more attention now, but you know, if one of those reactors is sort of hit, you're looking at a Chernobyl situation. And right now, you know, they obviously have control of Chernobyl too, which is in Ukraine, and it's only, you know, a couple of hours from Kyiv. So it's definitely a scary thing, and I think not necessarily that Russia would target a nuclear plant, because the widespread damage would really affect their own ability to try to govern this country. But I certainly think it's a high possibility that it could be struck indirectly in the fighting and cause a huge amount of damage. So it's a high threat for sure.
This is a great question from one of our audience members. What do you think the off-ramp is? What do you think are the possibilities for an end of conflict? What does that even look like at this point?
I don't, you know, it's very hard to think what an end point is. I mean, people keep talking about Putin eating it out, but I think the damage there is done. I don't know that there really isn't out for him. I mean, you know, his own country is very much, you know, going to suffer. Whether they choose to blame their president or choose to blame the United States for that remains to be seen. But I think that huge damage, you know, those things are not necessarily going to be undone anytime soon. So I don't necessarily see an out for that. To be honest with you, I don't know what that would really look like. If Ukraine is certainly not willing to give up territory, that is a possible out, but I don't think that is really going to be plausible at this point. So that is concerning because we don't know what approach Putin will take next. If he just sort of sees it, okay, as a lost cause and just wants to go out on an all-out bombing campaign, then that's certainly in the realm of possibility as well. And you certainly, I don't think, dealing with a very rational actor. I think at one point Putin was a rational actor, and I don't think he's the same person he was 20 years ago.
A great question as well from Hall. She's wondering what we can do in the United States that would actually be helpful, not necessarily from a policy perspective, But is there, everyone's watching this situation, Holly, trying to imagine ourselves in it, right? And
Yeah.
what would we do? And then how could we help? And do you have any thoughts on how the average American or whoever the average person is, wherever they're watching all over the world, could be
I think
part of the solution?
There are great NGOs doing great work. There are places, you can go donate to the International Committee of the Red Cross. You can donate to Rescue. You can donate to one that I work with here, Pirogov Mobile Hospital. I think really that is sort of the best approach Americans can do, is to support local NGOs that are helping Ukrainian people, that are especially ones that are remaining here, that can't leave or don't sort of have the means to leave. So I think it's important to keep that support alive. Again, I know it's a very helpless situation for people, but I think supporting through NGOs is really the best thing that can be done by Americans right now, and also putting pressure on your local governments to take whatever necessary steps are needed to take, with keeping in mind the safety of the United States, but to put our support behind Ukraine, because it is a country of 44 million and Russia is a country of 144 million. And again, this was a very unprovoked war. And often when I see wars, you look at nuances, you look at, even with the quote unquote enemy, see where maybe they're coming from a little bit, and you put yourselves in their shoes. But in this case, it really was an unprovoked war. It wasn't as if Ukraine, went in and tried to retake Crimea or, instigated some sort of attack. The justification for this war was sort of completely fabricated by the Kremlin. So, to me, it's one of those situations that is a lot more black and white than a lot of wars I've covered in the past.
Real quick, final question, Holly, then I promise I really will let you go. There's a lot of questions about the Ukrainian government. We've talked about in the past that corruption has been a part of the Ukrainian government. And just sort of as the government's trying to emerge from a period where it was under kind of had a direct line to Russia, and it's trying to be an independent, free, democratic state. It's new at that, and that corruption has been an issue for the Ukrainian government. Is there any way you could give a little context to that? Or, I mean, you've been there over the years, so we can understand, we can talk about the history and also say what's happening to the Ukrainian government right now by Russia is wrong. So can you provide a little context?
Past Ukraine is the government issues is being terribly corrupt in terms of, oligarchs being able to pay off to have, certain contracts and development, and unfortunately, it's something you see in a lot of countries, but Ukraine was especially bad. I think the Zelensky government, whilst they have not been able to obviously wipe it out, I think have taken big strides in trying to eliminate a lot of the corruption that existed, under Poroshenko previously, and then of course Viktor Yanukovych, who was in power, who was a pro-Putin person who was in power up until the Maidan Revolution of 2014. So that, came with a big history of corruption as well. But certainly not perfect. Certainly, as a government has a long way to go. But I do think that the Zelensky government really, did take some strides to start to clean up so sort of that internal corruption.
And Zelensky ran on that platform. That's one of the reasons he was kind of catapulted into fame, is that he had some sort of viral video about corruption. And now, I mean, you never know what sort of twists and turns life will take you. And he's certainly been on an interesting trajectory.
When he was elected, people were actually concerned that he was going to be too friendly to Putin, because he kind of in the beginning was extremely open to wanting talks to Putin and wanting to have these really great relationships with Russia, and that actually scared a lot of people, and scared the West, because they thought, oh my goodness, is this guy going to be some sort of stooge for Russia? So I guess, he certainly didn't come to office in 2019 with this idea to stick it to Russia, but as you can see, in any way, sort of trying to even play ball in any way didn't get you there. And I think that that Putin, had already his mind made up. He's reaching 70. He wanted to leave some sort of legacy, and I think that unfortunately, invading Ukraine was, part of his somehow delusional grand plan.
What's your next report, Holly? What are you working on tomorrow? Do you have something planned?
Yeah, so I'm sort of working on a bunch of different things, just sort of looking at a lot of the evacuation issues, and then some, escapes from Mariupol, and just daily life in Kyiv as well. I'm trying to very much do, I guess, sort of the human interest stories is what I focus on. Really, is individual people stories that are extremely compelling, that are a micro, that can sort of paint a very macro picture of a larger war. So for me, it's really finding those individual stories. And right now, I have a call with the Ministry of Defense spokesperson, so I'll sort of get up to date on things that are happening militarily. And then I'm hoping to sort of do some hospital visits tomorrow, military hospitals and children's hospitals, and kind of, again, find those very personal stories. And I'm not necessarily a breaking news reporter. That's not really my thing. But I like to tell things in a little bit more of an individual and kind of compelling way, so that people can understand what is happening.
Well, we really appreciate it, Holly. You go do that phone call. I'm going to tell everybody how they can support you and follow along. And of course, we'll be continuing to watch your reporting on Smarter News. And I'm so grateful. As always, it's great to see you. It's always great to get the video text messages, but I like seeing you in real life. Look, that's always better.
And thank you to all the Smarter News followers again for your kind words and support as well. I very much appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Holly. I appreciate it too. All right, when Holly, I'll give everybody. You got to go. You can X out, and I'll go ahead. I want to show them a couple different ways. Thank you very much to Holly. I don't want to make her late for that phone call if she has it with the defense official. I also want to show you something really quick. Just a reminder, you can watch Holly, follow along with her on social media, Holly S. McKay, for those of you who are listening on our podcast, but also sign up for her Substack. It's a great way to support journalism. It's the cost of buying yourself a latte once a month. So it's just a way for Holly to remain independent, to do the work that she really wants to do. And you can see she's a very unique person with very wonderful talents, that she's able to share these stories with the rest of the world. And that's a gift. So you're supporting someone with the gift to actually do good in the world of journalism and also keep us most informed. I want to leave you with this. Right before I jumped on with Holly, one of the things I was looking at was a little history about Russian wars and the use of chemical weapons, and just a little bit more, again, those contexts that journalists can fill in. If the Pentagon or the White House is going to give some response, well, we can also fill in the context. So this is the picture, one of the pictures yesterday from southern Ukraine, where you see where this was apparently the hospital and the maternity hospital that was struck, or a bomb struck nearby and destroyed these buildings. And this was one of the big stories of the week because it's horrific on every level. And when you actually see the crater that's in the ground next to these buildings, you get an idea of the sort of the extent of which Russia is going. And these relatively small cities to bring overwhelming force. But check out this. Take a look at that real quick. And take a look at this picture. Not that different, right? That was in 1999, the Russian war with Chechnya. Let me show you something else. This is another picture from the first war with Chechnya. This is Grozny. This is a city that was determined to be the most destroyed city in the entire world. Russia came in. There was about a 2-year war in 1995. There was another war in 1999. David Satter talks about that in our previous interviews. He was the correspondent in Moscow during the time and covered Vladimir Putin's rise to power. One of the ways that Vladimir Putin rose to power is that there was a new war, a second war in Chechnya. And this is what Russia did to that area. They came in, they were met with a resistance both times. But as far as targeting anything, whether it's civilian areas, government areas, military positions, it didn't matter. They completely leveled the city. And so this is what Russia's done in the past. So when we see pictures that look like this, and you're seeing the destruction, know it's consistent with past military missions in Russia. And those are the images that we have. So it's important to keep that in mind. Well, how far can Russia go? Well, how violent will they be? They've shown us. They've shown us in the past. And I want to make sure that we continue to remember that. So I'm going to go ahead and hop off, do a little bit more reporting today on a couple different sides of this story. One of the areas I'm really interested in is what's happening along the coast of Ukraine. You have a lot of ships that are stuck. along the coast. And you also have ships and sailors that belong to countries all over the world. So that's sort of an interesting dynamic that we haven't talked a lot about. And ports are really important, not just for getting supplies into Ukraine, but also because we want to see the shipping channels open and free to get supplies moving all over the place, whether or not it's just in the area of Eastern Europe and beyond. So we have a couple different things to watch, not only what the White House is saying, what the Ukrainian government is saying, what the Russian government is saying. We have a new quote from the foreign minister up on our website. So we have multiple sides. And just as understanding that each day we're moving further into this conflict, the war that's happening, Russia's war on Ukraine. And, even a month ago, you'd have people that say, oh, we would never be here. This would never happen. And now here we are. So a lot to think about. Curious your questions and comments as always. Please go ahead and send them in. You can always email us at hello@smarternews.com. And we have a bunch more information along with links to a bunch of resources as well on our website, smarternews.com. All right, that's all for now. More coming. And thank you so much for your support of Smarter News. Have a great day.